Malik Thompson, a 12-year-old boy with a mop of unruly curls and a pair of oversized sneakers, trudged home from school along the cracked sidewalks of West Haven. His backpack, far too heavy for someone his size, bounced with each step, weighted not just by textbooks but also by the silent worry he carried for his mother. The late afternoon sun dipped below the rooftops of their neighborhood, casting long shadows over the graffiti-lined buildings. He had spent the day dodging taunts from classmates and trying to ignore the growl of his stomach during lunch. But all of that seemed inconsequential as he approached the rickety door of the apartment he shared with his mother. Leah. She had been unwell for days, a persistent fever robbing her of her usual energy. Malik couldn't shake the image of her pale face when he left for school that morning. The door creaked loudly as he stepped inside. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in their tiny kitchen. Malik called out, "Mom!" His voice echoed off the peeling wallpaper. No answer. Panic started to creep in. He set his backpack down carefully by the door and stepped further inside. The small apartment was dimly lit, the shades drawn tight against the glaring afternoon sun. As Malik approached the kitchen, the first thing he noticed was the plastic grocery bag still sitting on the counter. She hadn't put it away. The second thing was the pot of soup boiling over on the stove, steam rising in an ominous hiss. And then he saw her. "Mom!" Malik dropped everything and ran to Leah, who was slumped on the kitchen floor, her breathing shallow and labored. Her face was pale, a sheen of sweat glistening on her forehead. He shook her gently. "Mom, wake up, please." She didn't respond. Malik's heart raced as he frantically turned off the stove, the bubbling soup splashing onto his arm. He barely felt the sting. Returning to his mother's side, he crouched and pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. Her skin felt clammy, and her breathing was uneven. He bolted for the living room, yanking her cell phone off the charger. His fingers shook as he dialed 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" A calm, detached voice answered. "It's my mom," Malik cried. "She's unconscious, and I think she's really sick. She's not breathing right, please. I need help. Can you provide your location?" The operator asked in the same monotone. 1378 Parker Street, apartment 2B. Malik rattled off. "Please hurry. She's pregnant too. She's gonna have a baby." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough to make Malik's stomach twist. "That's in West Haven, right?" the operator finally said, her tone shifting ever so slightly. "Our units are spread thin tonight. We'll get someone there as soon as we can." Malik couldn't believe what he was hearing. "But she needs help now. She's not breathing right." "I understand," the operator said, her tone now brisk and dismissive. "Do what you can to keep her stable until emergency services arrive." The line went dead. Malik stared at the phone in disbelief. He had done everything right, called for help, given the address, but they weren't coming. Not right away. Anyway, he looked back at his mother's motionless form and felt an overwhelming wave of fear. For a moment, Malik froze. His mind spun with panic. But then a voice rang out in his head. "You're not alone. You just have to ask for help." He bolted to the door and flung it open, yelling down the hallway, "Miss Clara! Mr. Ramos! Somebody! Please help!" Doors began to creak open. Miss Clara, an older woman who lived across the hall, shuffled out in her slippers, her face creased with concern. "What's going on, Malik?" "It's my mom," he choked out. "She's not breathing right. And I called 911, but they're not coming." Miss Clara's face darkened. She turned and banged on the door next to hers. "Ramos, get out here. We got an emergency." Within moments, more neighbors were spilling into the hallway. Mr. Ramos, a wiry man with paint-stained hands, grabbed a phone and began calling the local fire department directly. A young couple from the apartment above brought down a first aid kit, and Miss Clara pushed past Malik into the kitchen. When she saw Leah, her expression softened, though her hands moved with swift determination. "Malik, give me a cold cloth," she ordered. "We need to bring her fever down." The apartment buzzed with activity as the neighbors rallied around Malik and his mother. Someone opened the windows to let in fresh air, while another neighbor ran down to the street to flag down the ambulance if it ever arrived. Malik knelt by his mother's side, his small hand clutching hers. "Hang on, Mom," he whispered. "You gotta hang on." The distant wail of sirens finally reached their ears, and Malik felt a surge of relief. The neighbors parted as the paramedics burst through the door, their movements quick and efficient. They checked Leah's vitals, administered oxygen, and carefully loaded her onto a stretcher. "We're taking her to County General," one of them told Malik. "Are you her son? Do you have someone who can come with you?" "I'll go," Miss Clara said firmly, stepping forward. "Ramos, stay here and keep an eye on the boy." "No way," Malik protested, his voice rising. "I'm coming with her." The paramedic hesitated but nodded after a moment. "All right, kid, but you gotta stay out of the way. Let us do our job." Malik climbed into the back of the ambulance, his heart pounding as he watched the paramedics work to stabilize his mother. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and muffled voices, but Malik held on to Leah's hand the entire way. At County General, the sterile smell of disinfectant and the bright fluorescent lights made Malik feel small and out of place. A nurse guided him to a waiting room, where Miss Clara joined him shortly after. "She's in good hands now," Miss Clara said, though her voice wavered with worry. "They'll do everything they can." Malik sat in silence, his knees drawn up to his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about the 911 operator's voice, the way she had dismissed his plea for help. If it hadn't been for the neighbors, would his mom have even made it to the hospital? Hours passed before a doctor finally approached them. Malik shot to his feet, his heart in his throat. "She's stable," the doctor said, and Malik nearly collapsed with relief. "But she's still in critical condition. We're monitoring both her and the baby closely." Miss Clara put an arm around Malik's shoulders. "You hear that? She's stable. Malik, she's a fighter." The hospital waiting room was unbearably quiet except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Malik sat on the edge of a plastic chair, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. His stomach churned, both from hunger and the overwhelming anxiety of not knowing what was happening to his mother. The word "stable" kept ringing in his head, but he didn't know what it really meant. Was she okay? Was the baby okay? Miss Clara sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She had been quiet for the past hour, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a scarf. The sound was oddly soothing, a steady rhythm that helped fill the silence. "Malik," she finally said, her voice soft, "you've been sitting there for hours. Why don't you get up and stretch your legs? Maybe grab something to eat?" "I'm not hungry," he muttered, his gaze fixed on the double doors at the far end of the hallway. They led to the intensive care unit, where his mother was being treated. He hadn't seen her since they'd arrived at the hospital, and the thought of leaving the waiting room, even for a moment, felt impossible. Miss Clara sighed, but didn't push him. She understood the weight he was carrying, a weight far too heavy for a boy his age. Instead, she reached in her bag and pulled out a small wrapped sandwich. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "At least take a bite. Your mama wouldn't want you to starve." Reluctantly, Malik unwrapped the sandwich and took a small bite. The bread was dry, and he barely tasted the peanut butter and jelly inside. But he forced himself to eat. He had to keep his strength up for his mom. The hours dragged on. Nurses came and went, but no one had any updates for him. The waiting was unbearable, and Malik felt like he was teetering on the edge of a breakdown. He couldn't stop replaying the events of the day in his head, finding his mother on the floor, calling 911, begging the operator to send help. The memory made his chest tighten with anger and fear. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, a doctor appeared in the doorway. Malik jumped to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. "Malik Thompson?" the doctor called, scanning the room. Malik hurried over, Miss Clara right behind him. "How's my mom?" Malik asked, his voice trembling. "Is she okay?" The doctor smiled gently, though his eyes were tired. "She's stable," he said. "Her fever has come down, and her breathing has improved. We're still monitoring her closely, but she's showing signs of recovery." Malik's knees felt weak with relief. and he leaned against Miss Clara for support. "Can I see her?" he asked. The doctor hesitated. "She's still very weak, but I think it would be good for her to see you. Just keep it brief." "Okay." The ICU was a stark contrast to the chaos of the day before. The machines beeped softly, their steady rhythms providing a strange sense of comfort. Malik's heart pounded as he approached his mother's bed, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Leah lay motionless, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. An oxygen mask covered her face, and 4 lines snaked out from her arms. She looked so small and fragile, nothing like the strong, determined woman Malik knew. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He reached out and gently took her hand in his. It was cool to the touch, and he squeezed it lightly, hoping for some kind of response. For a moment, nothing happened, but then her fingers twitched, ever so slightly. Malik's breath caught in his throat. "Mom, it's me," he said, his voice trembling. "It's Malik. I'm here." Her eyes fluttered open, just a sliver, and Malik felt a surge of relief. She looked at him, her gaze unfocused, but filled with recognition. "Malik," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Baby." Tears welled up in Malik's eyes, but he blinked them back. "I'm here." "Mom," he said, gripping her hand tighter. "You're going to be okay. The doctors are taking care of you." She gave a faint nod, her eyes closing again. Malik stayed by her side, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he hoped that his presence would give her strength. Back in the waiting room, Malik found Miss Clara speaking with a small group of neighbors who had gathered to check on Leah's condition. Mr. Ramos was there, along with Rico and even Mrs. Patel, who rarely left her apartment. "How's your mama?" Mr. Ramos asked, his voice gruff but filled with concern. "She's stable," Malik said, repeating the word the doctor had used. "She's awake, but she's still really weak." The neighbors nodded solemnly. They all knew how hard Leah had worked to provide for Malik and her unborn child. She was a pillar of their community, always willing to lend a hand or offer a kind word despite her own struggles. "We're going to help," Rico said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Whatever you need, Malik, we've got you." Malik looked around at the faces of his neighbors, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had always thought of them as just the people who lived in his building, but now he realized they were something more. They were family. Over the next few days, the community rallied around Malik and his mother. Miss Clara stayed at the hospital with Malik, making sure he ate and slept. Mr. Ramos organized a collection to help cover Leah's medical expenses, while Rico and some of the other neighbors took turns checking on the apartment and making sure everything was in order. Malik spent most of his time by his mother's side, talking to her and reading aloud from her favorite books. Each day, she grew a little stronger, her color returning and her voice gaining strength. The doctors were optimistic, but they warned that her recovery would take time. Through it all, Malik remained steadfast. He had grown up more in the past few days than he ever thought possible. He had learned the true meaning of resilience, of what it meant to fight for the people you love. And he had discovered the strength of a community united by compassion and care. In the days that followed, Malik became a fixture in the hospital, rarely leaving his mother's side except when the nurses forced him to take breaks. He felt a responsibility to stay, not just to comfort her, but because he believed his presence was somehow helping her get better. Each time she opened her eyes and smiled at him, even faintly, it renewed his determination. But Malik also began to notice something else. He wasn't just fighting for his mother. He was learning to fight for himself. The encounter with the 911 operator still lingered in his mind. The way she had dismissed his cries for help simply because of where he lived. It made him angry, and that anger had started to grow into something else, resolve. One afternoon, while his mother was asleep, Miss Clara sat down beside him in the waiting room. "You've been awfully quiet today," she said, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "What's on your mind, child?" Malik hesitated, unsure if he could put his thoughts into words. But Miss Clara had a way of drawing things out of people, her presence warm and steady like an anchor in a storm. "It's not fair," he finally said, his voice low but firm. The way they treated us when I called 911. If the ambulance had come sooner, his throat tightened, and he swallowed hard. It's like they didn't care because of where we live. Miss Clara stopped knitting, her sharp eyes fixing on him. You're right, she said simply. It's not fair. But what are you going to do about it? Malik looked at her, startled. What can I do? I'm just a kid. Just a kid. Miss Clara raised an eyebrow. You're the same boy who rallied this whole community to save your mama. Don't underestimate yourself. Malik, if you see something wrong, you speak up. That's how things change. Her words stuck with him. And that night, as he sat by his mother's bed, he started to form a plan. He didn't know exactly how he would do it, but he was determined to make sure that what happened to his family wouldn't happen to anyone else. Leah's recovery was slow but steady. The swelling in her lungs had gone down, and the doctors had reduced the dosage of her medications. Though she was still weak, her spirit was unshaken. Every time she looked at Malik, she saw the strength he had found in himself during her illness, and it filled her with pride. One afternoon, as Malik sat by her bed reading from one of her favorite books, Leah reached out and touched his hand. Malik, she said softly, her voice still raspy but stronger than it had been days before. Thank you. Malik looked up from the book, confused. For what? For everything, she said, her eyes filling with tears. For calling for help, for staying by my side, for being stronger than I could have ever imagined. You saved me, baby. Malik felt a lump in his throat, and he squeezed her hand tightly. I just did what I had to do, he said. I couldn't let you go. Leah smiled weakly. You didn't just save me. Malik, you brought this community together. Miss Clara told me how everyone pitched in to help. That's something special. Her words made Malik's chest swell with pride, but they also reminded him of the responsibility he felt. He didn't just want to help his mom. He wanted to help everyone in their neighborhood, to make sure no one else had to face the kind of fear and neglect they had experienced. When Leah was finally well enough to leave the hospital, the entire neighborhood came together to welcome her home. Rico had organized a small gathering in the courtyard of their apartment building, complete with homemade dishes from nearly every family in the complex. Leah was overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support. She hugged each neighbor tightly, tears streaming down her face as she thanked them for everything they had done. Malik stood by her side, his heart full as he watched the people who had once felt like strangers come together as a family. But Malik's determination hadn't faded. In fact, it had grown stronger. That evening, after everyone had gone home, he sat down at the kitchen table with Miss Clara, Rico, and his mom. I want to do something, he said, his voice steady, to make sure no one else has to go through what we did. I want to talk to the city about what happened with the 911 call. Leah looked at him, surprised. Malik, that's a big task, she said. Are you sure you're ready for something like that? I have to try, he said firmly. It's not just about us, Mom. It's about everyone in our neighborhood. They treat us like we don't matter. But we do. We have to show them that. Miss Clara nodded approvingly. That's the spirit, Malik. And you won't be doing it alone. We'll all be behind you. Malik spent the next few weeks gathering stories from his neighbors, asking them to share their experiences with the emergency services system. He was shocked by how many people had faced similar neglect, delayed ambulances, dismissive operators, even outright refusals to send help. With Miss Clara's guidance, he wrote a letter to the city council, detailing his own experience and the stories he had collected. Rico helped him organize a petition, which quickly filled with signatures from nearly everyone in the building. When the day of the city council meeting finally arrived, Malik stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the tie Rico had lent him. He felt a knot of nerves in his stomach, but he also felt a sense of purpose that carried him forward. You've got this, Leah said, resting a hand on his shoulder. She was still recovering, but her strength was returning day by day. Just speak from your heart, Malik. They'll listen. And so he did, standing in front of the city council. Malik told his story with a quiet determination that silenced the room. He spoke about his love for his mother, his fear when the ambulance didn't come, and the way his neighbors had stepped in to fill the gap left by a broken system. By the time he finished, There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even the council members who had seemed indifferent at the start were visibly moved. "We can't ignore this," one of them said. "This is a failure on our part, and it needs to change." The changes didn't happen overnight, but Malik's efforts sparked a movement. The city implemented new training programs for 911 operators, ensuring they would treat every call with the urgency it deserved. Additional ambulances were assigned to underserved neighborhoods, and a community advisory board was created to oversee emergency services. For Malik, the most rewarding part wasn't the recognition he received from the city or even the changes that were made. It was the way his neighborhood began to transform. People who had once kept to themselves started working together, looking out for one another in ways they hadn't before. The sense of isolation that had once defined their lives was replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. And through it all, Malik grew into a young leader, someone his community could rely on. He still had moments of doubt, still felt the weight of everything he had been through. But he knew he wasn't alone anymore. He had his mother, his neighbors, and a newfound sense of strength that would carry him forward. As he sat on the stoop of his apartment building one evening, watching the kids play in the courtyard, Malik felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The future wasn't just something to fear, it was something to build. One step at a time, Malik's story began to ripple beyond the walls of his apartment building and into the wider city. News outlets picked up on his speech to the city council, labeling him a young advocate for justice. Interviews followed, where he shared not just his own experience but also the collective struggles of his neighbors. He was nervous at first, sitting in front of bright lights and cameras, but he reminded himself why he was doing it: for his mom, for Rico, for Miss Clara, and for everyone in their community who had been overlooked for too long. "Why did you decide to speak up?" a reporter asked him during one interview. Malik hesitated for a moment, then replied, "Because I had to. If we don't speak up, nothing changes. My mom almost didn't make it because someone decided our lives didn't matter as much. That's not right, and I couldn't let it go." His words struck a chord, sparking a citywide conversation about equity in emergency services. It wasn't just about ambulances or 911 calls. It was about the deeper issues of inequality that had been ignored for too long. Malik found allies in unexpected places. Local activists reached out to support his efforts, offering guidance on how to organize and keep the pressure on city officials. Teachers at his school praised him, sharing his story with students as an example of how one person could make a difference. But Malik's newfound visibility wasn't without challenges. Some people pushed back, accusing him of exaggerating the problems or blaming the wrong people. He even received a few hateful messages online, which stung more than he wanted to admit. One evening, as he sat in the living room with his mom, he finally voiced his frustration. "Why do people hate me for trying to help?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Leah reached over and took his hand. "Because change scares people, Malik. But remember, you're not doing this for them. You're doing it for us, for our community, and for every person who doubts you. There are 10 more who believe in you." Her words gave him strength, and he resolved to keep going, no matter how hard it got. Inspired by Malik's advocacy, the city announced a pilot program called Response for All, aimed at addressing the systemic issues in emergency services. Malik was invited to be part of the advisory board, a position he accepted with both excitement and trepidation. He was the youngest person in the room by far, but his insights were invaluable. At their first meeting, Malik spoke passionately about the need for cultural competency training for 911 operators and first responders. "It's not just about having more ambulances," he explained. "It's about making sure the people on the other end of the line see us as human beings, not just numbers or addresses." The board members listened intently, and Malik could see that his words were making an impact. For the first time, he felt like he was truly being heard by people in positions of power. Over the next few months, the pilot program began rolling out changes. New training sessions were held, and community members were invited to share their experiences with emergency responders. The city also invested in outreach efforts, hosting town hall meetings to rebuild trust with neighborhoods that had long felt abandoned. Malik attended every meeting he could, often standing in front of packed rooms to share his story and encourage others to speak up. He was nervous every time, but he pushed through the fear, knowing that his voice mattered. As Leah recovered, she found herself inspired by Malik's determination. She had always been proud of her son, but seeing him step into a leadership role had awakened something in her. She realized she wanted to do more for her community. 2. Leah started volunteering at the neighborhood center, helping organize food drives and literacy programs. She also became a vocal advocate for the Response for All program, often joining Malik at meetings and events. One day, as they walked home together from a town hall meeting, Leah turned to Malik with a smile. "You've changed a lot. You know." Malik looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You've grown into someone who doesn't just see problems, you solve them," she said. "That's a rare thing, Malik, and it's something to be proud of." Malik blushed, but her words stayed with him. He realized that his mother's strength and resilience had shaped him in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. The changes in the neighborhood weren't immediate, but they were undeniable. Rico organized a neighborhood watch program to ensure residents felt safer, and Miss Clara started a weekly community dinner in the building's courtyard, where everyone could share food and stories. Malik watched as the bonds between neighbors grew stronger. People who had once kept to themselves were now looking out for one another, offering rides to doctor's appointments, helping with childcare, and even pooling resources to fix up shared spaces in the building. One evening, as Malik sat on the stoop with Rico, he reflected on how far they had come. "It feels different now," he said, looking out at the courtyard filled with laughter and conversation. Rico nodded, a rare smile breaking across his face. "That's because you gave us something to believe in. Kid, you reminded us we're stronger together." A year after Malik's first speech to the city council, the Response for All program was fully implemented citywide. Malik was invited to a ceremony at City Hall to celebrate the program's success. Standing on the stage with his mother and Miss Clara in the audience, he felt a mix of pride and humility. When it was his turn to speak, Malik stepped up to the podium and looked out at the crowd. "This isn't just about me or my family," he began. "It's about all of us. It's about the neighbors who came together when my mom needed help, the people who shared their stories to make this program a reality, and the belief that no one should be ignored because of where they live. We did this together, and together, we can keep making things better." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Malik felt a warmth in his chest that he knew he would carry with him forever. As Malik and Leah walked home that evening, they passed by the park where neighborhood kids were playing basketball under newly installed lights, a small but meaningful improvement funded by the city's new community grants program. Leah stopped and looked at Malik, her eyes shining. "You built something here, Malik, something that will last." Malik shook his head. "We built it, Mom. All of us." And he was right. The changes in their community weren't the work of one person. They were the result of people coming together, finding strength in their shared struggles, and refusing to accept the status quo. As they walked the rest of the way home, Malik felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The future still held challenges, but he wasn't afraid. He knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. For Malik and his community, it was only the beginning.